Thank you for joining me for Session 5 in Explore the Bible, the studies of Ezekiel and Daniel. Our text is Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 11 through 19, and verse 25 through 26. The lesson summary statement is that God offers grace to the humble and brings down the proud. I'm using the example that's found in GoExploreTheBible.com about how you would keep the teams that are going to play in the national championship, how would you keep them from becoming arrogant in light of their recent victory this weekend? You can look at that and see how you would approach that. So I'm going to ask them, what actions would you take to keep the team from becoming arrogant about their recent victory? And then from that, we'll get into the text. The passage is addressed to the king of Tyre and his godless pride. Verse 2 of chapter 28 makes it very clear that this is addressed to the king. The previous chapters are addressed to the city of Tyre, chapter 26 and chapter 27. I'm going to ask the class to go to page 9 in their personal study guide just to be reminded about the outline that we've been given about the book of Ezekiel. And if you'll recall, the first point is Israel, a rebellious house, will fall. That's the point that Ezekiel is making in those first 24 chapters. And then in chapter 24, the message comes, Jerusalem has fallen. The second point, pagan nations will be destroyed, chapters 25 to 32. That's where this text is taken from, and it's the only text that we're going to have in which it comes from that section. So it's important to understand something of what's taking place in these chapters. Chapter 24, the prediction that Ezekiel had been telling the people back in exile, as well as speaking to the people in Jerusalem, has come about. The messenger comes to say that Jerusalem has fallen. We want to read on and find out what has happened to Jerusalem and what's happened to the people of Jerusalem. But like any good story, there is a pause, and we're required to wait to hear about the outcome of the people of Jerusalem. And in this pause, just like the exiles have to wait to hear the message, Ezekiel addresses God's judgment on the enemies of God and His people. And so he uses a form in speaking to Israel that is a courtroom justice scene. And that same form is the way he speaks to the nations that surround Jerusalem. You might want to go to the map in the back of your Bibles and show the people these nations. There's Ammon and Edom and Moab. Those were distant relatives of Israel. There's Philistia, which had been a thorn in Israel's side for centuries. And then towards the top, about 100 miles north of Jerusalem, to the northwest is Tyre, and beyond that is the country of Sidon. And he just takes that circle and he speaks a word of judgment to each of them. Now, you might be tempted to think that he's speaking to these nations and now he's going to speak to Israel that way. But that's really what's really happening, is the way that he's speaking to the nations is the way that he spoke to Israel, which is to say to Israel, just like these have been the enemies of God's purposes, you have been the enemy of God's purpose. It was a very shocking way to address Jerusalem. Now, while they hear of the defeat of Jerusalem and the destruction, he goes on to tell them that the day's coming. There's this little section, we'll see it in our lesson, there's this little section where he says, the day's coming when God will deliver Jerusalem. Over and over, the phrase, they will know that I am the Lord, is found in these chapters 25 to 32. And the passages are not an effort to fan the nationalism of Israel, but it's to help the nation see who is the true God. And as we've mentioned before, this phrase, they will know that I am the Lord, is really stating God's missionary purpose, that the nations would come to know Him throughout this world. In this passage, the background of it is Eden. And he's using the scene of Eden to show how far the king of Tyre has fallen. There's a debate among the scholars. Is this text also talking about Adam, or is it talking about Satan? And from early on, the scholars have been debating that. And so I'm not here to settle that issue, but I am wanting you to see that the main way we're supposed to interpret it at the very beginning, the first message we're to get, is to see what pride has done to the king of Tyre. He was given such great privilege, just like Adam in the garden, just like Satan in the garden, and pride caused him to be cast down, just like with Adam and just like with Satan. So it's a powerful picture warning us of the destruction of pride. Now, the first 10 verses of this chapter is a portrait of the king's selfish pride. And then these last verses that we're going to look at, verses 11 through 19, are talking about the rebellion of the king. So it begins with past glory, Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 11 through 15. Now, central to the lament is this great fall from this idyllic existence, the Garden of Eden. And that's the picture that's being said. And it can be said that what happens here is Ezekiel literally changes his tune, because that's what a lament is. You see verse 11, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, lament for the king of Tyre, and say to him, this is what the Lord God says, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom, perfect in beauty. A lament is a form of grief. It's to mourn. It is to regret. This formula that is used here is very common to laments. It starts off with the admirable qualities of the person that's being lamented. You should also know that a lament was used in funerals, and it was to stir the emotions so that the people would be led to grieve. And so what he's seeking to do in this testimony of the king of Tyre, verses 11 through 19, is he's stirring the emotions. There may even be tears in Ezekiel's eyes, weeping as he says this. It is extremely emotional in this text. Notice the great way in which he describes this king. He was the seal of perfection. Now that's talking about the signet ring. And the signet ring was given to a person who the king trusted, and he carried the authority of the king. And what God is saying to the king of Tyre is, you were my signet ring. I gave you such privilege. I gave you such status. And you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom, perfect in beauty. It's an exalting way of speaking of the great privilege this king has had from which he's fallen. And then verse 13. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Now, obviously, that wasn't the king of Tyre. And that's what's caused some of the debate about, is he talking about Adam or is he talking about Satan? But remember, he's using the picture of Eden to show how very far this king has fallen because of his pride. God gave him tremendous privileges, tremendous status, tremendous wealth and beauty in the land, in the city of Tyre. And his pride has resulted in that being destroyed. So you were in Eden, the garden of God. Every kind of precious stone covered you. Carnelian, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and emerald. Those are oftentimes noted that there are 8 of the 12 stones that are found in the clothing of the high priest. And its overall purpose is just to show the exalted status of this king. Your mountings and settings were crafted in gold. They were prepared on the day you were created. Here's another one of those words that causes the scholars to debate. The word here is the same word that's used in Genesis 1 when it spoke about God creating the world. And the word talks about creating out of nothing. Well, obviously, the king wasn't created out of nothing. Adam was, and Satan was. But again, I'm wanting to make the point that he's using that picture to talk about the high place this king has fallen. You were an anointed cherub, for I had appointed you. He had been given this special status. You were on the holy mountain of God. He had access to God, is what it was saying. You walked among the fiery stones. From the day you were created, you were blameless in your ways until wickedness was found in you. The king had opportunities that were simply grand, but he blew those opportunities just like Adam and Satan blew their exalted positions. That's the picture that's being painted for us here. Now, the question that I have for the class after looking at those texts and discussing them is, why didn't the king respond with gratitude and humility? I mean, isn't it puzzling? He's been given all of this by God, this great wealth, this great status, and instead his success and privilege made him arrogant instead of grateful. Why is that? And just ask that to the class for their discussion. The greater the good, the greater the temptation for corruption. We have such wealth in this country. When I get up in the morning, I have a cabinet full and a refrigerator full of food. And so it doesn't mean so much to me when Jesus taught that we were to daily pray for our bread. When Jesus taught that, he was talking to people who literally lived from day to day, from hand to mouth, in terms of food. He meant that literally. And yet, that kind of dependency is not what I experience. And so sometimes those kinds of benefits, that kind of wealth, can make me not be so dependent upon God, not think I need God so much. I mean, how many days has it been when you have gone well into your day before you thought, I need to spend some time with God in prayer? But if you lived in an experience where every day you woke up and you needed food, I imagine you'd start your day differently with that kind of a dependence upon God. This focus on self pushes God to the periphery. In short, we begin to see ourselves as independent and autonomous. And this is what happened to the king of Tyre. Picasso, the great artist, was a wicked man. He was an atheist, and since he had pushed God out of his life, he became God. It is said of Picasso by his third wife that he either saw women as doormats or goddesses. And those that he saw as goddesses, he began to push in the direction of doormats. His third wife said to him one time, "You are the devil." And Picasso took a cigarette butt and burned her cheek. And the only reason he stopped early is he said, "I may want to look upon your face again." He said the best thing that he wished he could do is he wished he could bury his wives and then he would be done with them. Picasso was a man that if he had the power to use it, he would use it in a way that was for his own benefit and to the detriment of other people. And the only reason he didn't take the lives of his wives is because he didn't have that kind of power. It's this kind of mindset that the king of Tyre is exhibiting and which God is now going to deal with. The second point is this rebellion denounced. God offers grace to the humble and brings down the proud. I'm going to ask the class to read with me, follow through with me, verses 16 through 19. And I want them to help me list the results of pride that God is going to denounce. I want them to see a list of the outcomes of pride. So they'll read through this, have someone read through that, and then we'll list those things. And it's things like, this is the result of pride: violence, sin, disgrace, banishment, corrupted wisdom, losing position, profaning the sanctuary, destruction, negative example. There may be other things that they want to add. And as you go through those, you can give an explanation about the text. For example, in verse 16, it's violence that associated with trade. Tyre was an extremely wealthy city. The city of Tyre was on a rock island just out from the mainland, and this gave it two great harbors. It also was impregnable. The walls were 15 stories high, 150 feet. And so it was virtually invincible in the ancient days. Syria tried to conquer the city of Tyre and didn't succeed. Babylon took 13 years in order to break down the city. And then Alexander the Great dismantled the city of Tyre on the shore and built a causeway out, and he took the city in something like 7-8 months. But in the eyes of the people of that day, it was invincible. The word Tyre means rock, and it was built on this rock of an island. And because of its invincibility, because of its great harbors, it was located so that the whole Mediterranean traded with it, and it became fabulously wealthy, fabulously luxurious. Notice in verse 17, arrogance is associated with his beauty and his intellectual corruption. It says in there that he had wisdom. And God doesn't have anything against business and using good business sense, but what he did is he used his good business sense to the detriment of others. One of the things that Tyre became wealthy in was the trading of slaves and the goods of other countries that were conquered. In verse 18, it's dishonest trading practices that made a mockery of religious practices. And notice in the last part of verse 18, I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of everyone watching. Again, there's echoes of judgment, and there's echoes of the Garden of Eden, for man returned to the dust. So this will give you a chance to engage the text, and then after you've made your list of all these consequences of pride, what I want to do is just stand back and say to the class, just look at that list. There's violence, there's sin, there's disgrace, there's banishment, corrupted wisdom, losing your position, profaning the sanctuary, destruction. Look at that list. This is what God is saying to the king of Tyre. This is what your pride has brought you. And I want to ask him, what comes to your mind about this list and its association with pride? And some of the things that I was thinking of is pride is dangerous. If you give yourself to pride, this is the consequences of it. Pride is judged by God. And you can see the reasons why. And I'm sure the class will have other things they'd like to discuss. Now, the issue is pride. Now, why not greed? Because it says in here, he was a greedy man. And there's a sense in which you can say that part of Adam and Eve's sin in the garden was greed. They wanted more than the place that God had given them. What about wickedness? This living in a way that is in rebellion and rejection to God's will. But what's being dealt with here is pride. What is it about pride that is so damning God will judge it? C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, has a chapter on pride. If you have that book, you may want to read it to help get a broad understanding of this subject of pride. Or you can go on the internet and just look up statements that C.S. Lewis has made that have been drawn from that chapter about pride. And I'm going to have about 4 different statements he's made about pride. I'll hand it out to the class beforehand, and then I'm going to ask the class member to read those statements and just ask the class to respond to those statements, because they're extremely insightful, and it helps us to understand why this rebellion is denounced by God. Now notice this. This happened to Adam and Eve. This happened to Satan. This happened to the king of Tyre. This happened to his own people in Jerusalem. When a person puts anything or anyone in God's place, listen to this, the events of Eden will be repeated. Do you see what God's doing here through the king of Tyre? He is warning his people, don't put your trust in any other system. Don't put your trust in any other person. Put your trust in God. So what are the ways we may detect pride in our lives so that it doesn't consume us? What are the ways that we can detect pride in our lives so it doesn't consume us? And what would indicate we're beginning to walk in pride? That's the way I intend to close out that point. Now the last point is hope stirred. This small section is right at the center of the messages to the nations. So you've had leading up to this, you've had God's judgment on Ammon and Edom and Moab and Philistia. And then there's 2 chapters that are dedicated to Tyre and Sidon. And then in chapter 28, there's this message of denouncing the pride of the king of Tyre. And then what's going to happen, he's going to finish it out by speaking about Egypt. But right in the middle, there's this pause. And there is this word of hope that is given. It is to tell Israel that God's actions against them in the future will be reconciliation and restoration. No one could have looked into the future and seen on the horizon that Israel would one day return to the promised land. Nobody would see that. Nobody would understand that after seeing what Babylon had done in decimating the nations all around Jerusalem and Judah, as well as Jerusalem and Judah. And right in the middle of this messages of judgment on the nations, there's this little message from God that says, but you, O Israel, I'm going to restore to the land. You see, it is one of the promises that God gave Abraham. One of the promises God gave Abraham is those who bless Israel will be blessed. Those who curse Israel will be cursed. We see the fulfillment of that in the prophecies to the nations. And one of the promises to God is Him to give them a land. And God's going to keep His promise. Now God makes them 7 promises in this passage. Notice the first one is, when I gather the house of Israel from the peoples where they are scattered. That's the first one. Number 2, I will demonstrate my holiness through them in the sight of the nations. And number 3, they will live in their own land, which I gave my servant Jacob. And number 4, they will live there securely. Number 5, they will build houses. Number 6, they will plant vineyards. Those 3 together are a way of showing prosperity and security and peace in the land. And they will live securely when I execute judgments. Number 7. Now, these previous promises are fulfilled when God subjects the nations that have been opposing Him and opposing Israel. So there are these acts of God's grace. This is what He's going to do for the humble. Now, to close the lesson, I'm going to give them a 3x5 card. On one side it says a ticket to the Titanic. If someone were to give you a ticket to the Titanic, and it was built by the same person, it was made out of the same materials with its flaws, it was going to travel the same route as the Titanic, the weather conditions with icebergs was exactly the same, and it was captained by the same man who captained the Titanic, and they gave you a ticket, would you get on it? Not on your life. Because you know what the outcome is going to be. Devastation, destruction. This is what God is seeking to convey to the people of Israel when they put their trust in anything else other than the living God. When they give themselves over to self-centered pride. And then on the back, I'm going to ask them to write this statement. And this statement, if you don't think you're going to have time, you may want to write it out for them. But then you may want to have them write this, because I think this is a good summary of what the lesson is about. It comes from John Stott. Pride is your greatest enemy. Humility is your greatest friend. Pride is your greatest enemy. Humility is your greatest friend. John Stott. I'm just going to ask them to keep that in their Bible and to ask God's Spirit this week to help them identify areas of pride and self-centeredness and self-exalting that needs to be humbled, and to practice humility this week in their relationship with God and their relationship with others. God bless you. This is a powerful lesson, and I'm praying for God to bless you and use you in your class this week.